So we're very happy that you joined us for this final session on Reformed thought and the crisis of democracy. And we're very grateful to Bruce Douglas for having this brainchild and bringing it through to fruition to this day. I'm going to turn this over to our presenter, Mr. Bruce Douglas. Thank you so very much, Bruce.
You're welcome. Last week, I talked about the
Yes.
crisis of democracy, which of course is one of the themes of this course. And I argued that, at least in the industrialized world, it is best to think of this crisis of democracy as a competition bordering on conflict between two different ideas of democracy, two different versions of democracy. One that I characterized, my preference is to characterize it as constitutional democracy. Those of you who were here last week or listened to the recording will remember that the alternative characterization sometimes it's more popular in our society is liberal democracy, but whether you characterize it as liberal democracy or constitutional democracy, it is being actively challenged today by people who have a different view that's widely characterized as populist democracy. This week, I want to build on what we did last week to talk more specifically about the religious dimension of this conflict that's unfolding in our country and others. And in the process, I want to introduce for your consideration yet one more important Reformed thinker on these matters, and that's Nicholas, known by his friends as Nick Wolterstorff. I consider him to be another very important contributor to the development of the Reformed political tradition. Let me start here. If the story that I have been telling, and it is a story that I have been telling, is right, people of faith have played a big role in the bringing about of this thing we called constitutional democracy. They were very active in its creation. They have been, as it's unfolded, active in its defense, active in its promotion. All along, they have played a significant role in that. And especially is that true of Reformed Protestants, who early on had an affinity for this idea and have been closely linked to it ever since. And I would go so far as to say the support for the idea of constitutional democracy is one of the defining features of the Reformed political tradition. It is something that is very commonly associated by historians in particular with the Reformed tradition. However, this picture that I've been painting is complicated by another consideration, which probably all of you are aware of, and I want to foreground it now today so we can think about it more directly and frontally. And that is, at the same time that there is in the Reformed tradition this strong affinity for constitutional democracy, there is also an extensive history, not a small history, but an extensive history of thinking of church and state as complementary, and complementary in a way that supports Christians seeking something which they provide the leadership for and even dominate. And I associate that with the idea of the Holy Commonwealth, something that we encountered earlier, especially in dealing with the Puritans. The Holy Commonwealth, church and state working together, complementing one another in pursuit of a social and political order which is conducive to righteous living. A social and political order which is conducive to righteous living. Now, that strain in Reformed thought continued well after the acceptance of the idea of toleration, the acceptance of the idea of religious liberty, and even the acceptance of, in principle, the idea of a separation, a formal separation of church and state. And I say it continued because, and I'm going to talk particularly here about the American experience, although the American experience is not unique. Even after the movement in the direction of the things I've just mentioned, there existed in the United States, there has existed in the United States, a kind of informal establishment, an informal establishment of Christianity, and more specifically, an informal establishment of Protestant Christianity. This is a kind of variation on the Christian Commonwealth idea. The name that I would conjure up out of our own history in this course is the name of not so much Henry Ward Beecher as his father, Lyman Beecher, who very, very strongly was a proponent of the following idea: the American Republic requires Protestant leadership. Let me say that again. The American Republic requires, of course, he meant white Protestant leadership. And he was really very adamant, and this is even after the Civil War. He was very adamant that as these immigrants come into this country from other parts of Europe that are not dominated by white Protestants, it is terribly important that we remain in control, lest the Republic be jeopardized. That idea, I'm guessing everybody on this call knows exactly where I'm going with this. That idea endured well into the 20th century. And the best evidence of that is the great struggle that took place around the candidacy of John Kennedy for the presidency, in which a large number of churches, Protestant churches, and Protestant leaders actively opposed Kennedy's run for the presidency on the grounds that he was a Roman Catholic. Not something else, but just the fact that he was a Roman Catholic, and that it would be dangerous. Indeed, some even characterized it as catastrophic if Kennedy was to be elected. I can remember in my own family that my father in particular, who was a Presbyterian minister, was just adamant about this, that this was a terrible thing. And then once Kennedy was elected, the mood began to change. But in the lead up to Kennedy's nomination and election as president, this old idea that white Protestants must be in charge of the country, lest the country be in deep trouble. Now, one of the most important things to grasp, I think, about our own situation is that in the last 50 years, that tradition has been frontally challenged. Let me say that again. That tradition, that idea that this is a country that was created by white Protestants and it should remain in the hands of white Protestants, that they should be in charge. That idea has been frontally challenged. It has been challenged in part, and I think it's important to try to figure out exactly what we're talking about here. It has been challenged in part because of a huge surge in religious pluralism in the industrialized democracies. Huge surge. Because of the movement of peoples that has taken place in the last 50 years. It's a byproduct of globalization. I remember Betty and I spent a wonderful year in Edinburgh 20 years ago, and I was struck walking around Edinburgh by the fact that there was a mosque right in the middle of Edinburgh. It's very prominent there, and of course we're very familiar with that in our own time. How these societies, which are just moving dramatically in a certain direction because of globalization, one of the byproducts of that is that they are becoming, in both ethnic and religious terms, more and more pluralistic. Needless to say, that's not a news flash for any of you. So that's part of it. But the other thing, and the thing which I think is even more important to grasp here, is at least in the American case, and I'm going to focus here on the American case, although later I can talk about one other case in particular, Hungary, which is a dramatic contrast in some respects to what's happening in Western Europe. There is a big shift going on in constitutional law with respect to the role of religion in public life. Let me say that again. A big shift going on over the last 50 years in constitutional law about the role of religion in public life. Now, again, the people on this call are well informed and don't need to have a lot of documentation of that. But let me just try to dot the I here by emphasizing this point. The drift of constitutional law on this matter of church and state has been in the direction of further and further, I would say, marginalization of religion in the public realm. I realize that's going to be complicated by things we're going to be experiencing, particularly in the last couple of years, but generally that has been the drift in the last 50 years. And I would say one of the main reasons for that is the embrace of the idea in liberal political philosophy and its implications for constitutional law of the idea that there should be an exclusion, or at least a marginalization of religion in public affairs. Now, you put those two things together, an increasing ethnic and religious pluralism, diversity, if you will, combined with a movement in constitutional law in the direction of marginalizing religious ideas, religious influences, it's not surprising at all that eventually that would provoke a reaction. And that reaction, I would say, is yet another reason. It's not the only reason, but it's another reason why we have this surge of populist politics in our own time. The religious dimension of the surge of populist politics in our time has to do with a reaction on the part of, in our country, mainly white Protestants, against this change, this shift that has been taking place with respect to the religious identity of the nation, and particularly the role of religion in public life. Another place where that took place, and I'll talk about it more later, is Hungary, where you have a kind of dramatic illustration of a reaction against it, a populist reaction against it. The populist reaction to this movement in the direction of increasing marginalization of religion, and I might add marginalization of religion in the nation's identity, its very identity, the reaction has taken the form of a pushback, an active pushback, so that people who identify with this populist reaction say the country may be moving in that direction, but it shouldn't be moving in that direction. It shouldn't be moving in that direction. And we want to, as much as possible, resist the trend in that direction. And oftentimes that is accompanied, as we all know all too well with Trump, that is accompanied with a kind of idea of recovery, of going back, of bringing back something which is in danger of being lost. Or still another metaphor for this idea is one of the things which drives religious populism, Christian populism in our time, is the idea that we need to turn things around, to recover what is in danger of being lost. And rather than keep moving in that direction, turn things around so that we're able to alter the direction of events. Now, people who think this way tend to be, to state the obvious, combative. They are culture warriors. They are rather strident culture warriors. And one of the consequences of that, and I think it's important to note this, is that they tend to take for granted the very things which are debatable, take for granted the things in their own position which are very debatable. And that makes it hard to find somebody in that camp who really is a kind of, shall we say, intellectually sophisticated proponent, somebody who recognizes that there are, shall we say, weaknesses in his position or vulnerabilities in his position that need to be addressed. And so, at least I have found that when I have gone to find articulate voices for this populist reaction on religious grounds, I found it hard to find people who really are appropriate for a course like this. You get polemic after polemic after polemic, and I have spared you people the need to read any of that because I think it may be useful in trying to make sense of how the polemicist reflects, but it doesn't get to the deeper issues involved. There are a few exceptions to this, however, and that's one of the reasons why I asked you to read Richard Newhouse's piece. Newhouse, for those of you who are not familiar with him, now deceased. He's not been with us for about 10 years, but In the sort of the last third of the 20th century and on into the first part of the 21st century, he was a very prominent conservative political thinker among religious people. Lutheran clergy, and I want to stress, he's not a Reformed thinker. He's a Lutheran clergyman, Missouri Synod Lutheran. That's a certain kind of Lutheran. He was initially made his fame as an opponent of the Vietnam War, and at that point he was more left than thou. But quickly, as many people did, changed over time and became quite conservative. He was one of the founders of First Things, a very, very important conservative journal among people who are conservative in their politics. And in 1994, he published a book, which those of you who are interested in this is worth reading, is quite worth reading, which is the foundation of this piece that I ask you to read for today. The title of the book is The Naked Public Square. Still well worth reading. It was published in 1994, made quite a splash in conservative circles, religiously and politically conservative circles. And you get the drift of what his thinking is from that piece I ask you to read. I think another important thing to note about Newhouse is that he eventually became a Roman Catholic convert. He was a convert to Roman Catholicism in his last years. Became actually a Roman Catholic priest. And that's, I'll just say as an aside, that is not uncommon among people who are rather conservative politically and theologically, especially if they are not sort of evangelicals, as he was not. But he, like a good number of others, migrated towards Roman Catholicism. And I think part of it has to do with his great kind of, I would say, uncritical respect for authority. A great and a longing, if you will, to provide a kind of to find a spiritual home in which there is a very, very strong focus on authority. Now, let me dissect a bit this piece that I ask you to read, which is, as I say, a kind of outgrowth of the book that I've just mentioned. Such an interesting title, A Strange New Regime, The Naked Public Square. A strange new regime, The Naked Public Square. This was published, I should say, in 1996 in First Things, the journal that he helped found. And it is a rather good summary of some of his key arguments. Strange new regime, what's the premise? The premise is that America's identity as a nation is slipping away. Its historic identity as a nation is slipping away, or at least its historic identity as a nation is being threatened. This is therefore a kind of national identity crisis, a national identity crisis. And why is this happening? It is happening, of course, the standard theme, because of secularizing elites who are leading the country in a direction which betrays you might say, the foundational premises of American, not just American government, but the American way of life. It's interesting to note, I think, and this is one of the things that I would say differentiates him from so many of the people that I think are less sophisticated proponents of this way of thinking, is that keep in mind, he's a theologically sophisticated guy. He's very well informed about theology as well as political philosophy. He distances himself from the idea of the Christian nation as such. If you read the piece carefully, you will see he says, I'm not advocating that we think of the United States as a Christian nation. I don't think that's a proper idea. But then, in the very next breath, he does the following. He says, this nation is founded on certain values which are, he characterizes them as Judeo-Christian. This country is founded on Judeo-Christian, was founded, and to a large extent for much of its history has been based upon Judeo-Christian values. And then with a kind of nod to the very important issue of, well, with what appeal, with what what percentage of the American people embrace these values, his insistence is that those values are held by the vast majority of Americans, by the vast majority of Americans. So he's holding himself out here. And by the way, this for the longest time has been one of the currents of this populist way of thinking. We represent the real Americans. We represent the real, you might say, America correctly understood. The real Americans, the vast majority of Americans, some of us will remember moral majority, the majority of Americans believe and think this way. But as I said earlier, his claim is that these values are increasingly threatened by the espousal of a different way of thinking by elites. Elites located where? This requires little elaboration to you because you know almost exactly what I'm going to say here. It's the press, it's the universities, and the thing which really gets his attention above all is the courts. The courts. Now, keep in mind, at this point, people who thought this way looked upon the courts, and especially the Supreme Court, on the whole as the enemy. But the federal judiciary was a huge problem in their minds. These elites are moving us in a direction which rather directly calls into question, challenges, undermines the political efficacy of values which are so widely held by the rest of the American people. And implicitly, what's going on here is a shift in our identity as a nation. We had one foundation, and we're being pulled slowly, step by step, in the direction of having a different basis for our public life, and therefore a different identity. He's not as elaborate in this piece as he is in his book about what exactly the alternative view that's being promoted and acted on by these elites is. But in the book, he says roughly the following. I'm summarizing here a whole chapter. He says, these people take the increasing cultural diversity of our nation and turn it into something like a hard fact of moral pluralism. He says, the old consensus of, above all, white Protestants, that is being replaced by a view that emphasizes diversity of values. And that in turn leads to from cultural diversity to moral pluralism, and eventually to something that he characterizes as moral relativism. That moral relativism is the direction in which this goes. Now, other authors, and let me just insert as a sort of other supplement to this, other authors would say, well, it's not moral relativism per se, it's just the primacy of personal choice. That we're moving from a position in which there was a clear idea of right and wrong towards a situation in which we privilege personal choice regardless of the moral quality of those choices. The picture that's painted, of course, of movement in this direction is one that's unambiguously dark. The more we move in this direction, the worse it's going to be for the moral identity of the nation. Let me say parenthetically here, it's actually more than a parenthesis, the issue which above all agitated these people, and it's so interesting to read them now and think about them now in the light of the way they thought in the 1990s. The thing that agitated them above all was abortion decisions which seem to, in qualified ways, maintain the validity of Roe v. Wade. Real animosity towards the court with respect to its acceptance of what Newhouse and others believed was just obviously morally wrong, and contrary to the moral consensus that Americans previously had. But another part of this, interestingly enough, and led to actually a crisis in the editorial board of First Things in the late 1990s was over assisted suicide. There were some court decisions which accepted the constitutionality. I believe the source of the case was Oregon, in which there was legislation that legitimized, accepted the possibility of physicians participating in assisted suicide, and that just even more led then to the conclusion that the country was being led in a terrible direction. Now, the question that is sort of dangling toward the end of Newhouse's article, but not so much in the book where he says more elaborately the things I'm about to say. This feeling that they had, that the country was being moved by the courts, with the courts as sort of the central focus of a larger movement of secularization in our public life, the feeling that that was happening in the country, and that the country is being pulled in that direction away from its historic Judeo-Christian values, posed an obvious problem. What do you do about it? What do you do about it? If you're convinced that this calamitous thing is happening, what do you do about it? And again, this is so interesting in the light of, to read it today, to read these words written in the 1990s against the background of what's been happening in our country recently. The first response on the part of Newhouse and others was to say, we have got to do something about the courts. We got to do something about the courts. Now that could mean all kinds of different things, and he was not enough of a student of judicial politics to be able to sort of elaborate a program for that. But the program was clearly, what was implied in that was steps that would enable this movement to, in the courts, especially in the composition of the courts, to move the country away from this pull in the direction of a set of what they thought were secularist outcomes. Minimally, that meant put people on the court that were of a different persuasion, reconstitute the membership of the courts in such a way as to pull the country in a different direction. Now that I want to stress, even though we've, as I indicated last time, it's been compromised somewhat by the politics of judicial appointments in the Senate, that in principle is a constitutionalist move. That is, confronted with a problem that you believe resides in the courts, then your constitutional remedy is what? To get some kind of change in the composition of the courts. Or alternatively, another thing that was talked about was to try to restrict the courts with regard to what they could decide and not decide. And of course, another possibility was to have legislative action which would overrule judgments made by the courts. So there was a body of thought growing out of this kind of argument that Newhouse articulated. And I hope you can see the importance of the dates, beginning in the 1990s and then extending all the way up to our present time. This is the sort of the cultural and intellectual background to the populist surge. No populist surge yet when Newhouse is writing, but you can see it sort of in an embryonic form in some of these claims. But then the next question is, if you can't solve this problem by constitutional means, then what do you do? Let me say that again. If you can't solve this problem by, so we say conventional constitutional means, then what do you do? And there was at that time very little talk of extra constitutional measures, but you can see how somebody getting into this state of mind, the country is being pulled terribly in the wrong direction, the courts are playing a big role in this. If you can't solve it constitutionally, then what do you do? And I would submit to you that is the soil out of which you get, at least for the religious part of the topic, the appeal of populist thinking. Now, having talked about that, let me talk about Nick Wolterstorff's argument and try to summarize some of the main themes of that. and then stop. We'll take a break and then come back and have some discussion. And also in the last part of my presentation later, I'll offer some further thoughts about Wolterstorff and also talk about Hungary, which is very important, I think, to grasp what it represents, not just empirically, that is what it represents as a phenomenon, but also the role that it is playing in populist thinking in the world today, especially in the United States, where in these conservative circles it has great appeal. Let me draw a distinction. I'm sure everybody on this call knows that there are some obvious political objections that can be brought against the agenda that Newhouse articulates. But those objections, more often than not, as we hear them today, are stated in secular terms. They're terms about the meaning of democracy understood in a secular way. A lot of it, by the way, those arguments that are made against the sort of thing that Newhouse represents, pit the Constitution against religion. Constitutional values are one side, religion on the other side, as though they were appropriately thought of as opposites and even enemies. Now, Wolterstorff is different. Wolterstorff is different in important ways. He is obviously, I hope it's obvious to you, a person of faith. He is a person of faith. He's a devout person. By the way, his background is this. He's, of course, an American citizen, philosopher by training, by trade, a kind of one of the reasons why his way of expressing himself is what it is that he's an analytical philosopher, which has been the dominant kind of philosophy in much of the English-speaking world in the last 30, 40 years. He comes out of a very strong, he's rooted in the Dutch Reformed world, not the Presbyterian world, but the Dutch Reformed world. Went to Calvin College, went to Harvard, got his PhD, then went back and taught at Calvin College for many years, and then wound up teaching at Yale Divinity School as the professor of philosophical theology. And when he retired from Yale, he then went down to a emeritus resident scholar position at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, where he now is. I should say he's been a very successful, had a very successful scholarly career, but he's also a political activist. He was very active, given his Dutch Reformed identity. He was very interested in South Africa and was, as an American, committed to the anti-apartheid struggle, spent a lot of time in South Africa. And another thing that's very interesting to note about him is that he's also gotten very interested in the Palestinian struggle and written extensively on the Palestinian struggles in relation to the nation of Israel. So if you want the policy side of Nick Wolterstorff, it's right there. He is very self-consciously a Reformed thinker. I want to stress that. He is somebody who writes as a Reformed thinker. Most all of his writing is in that vein, but especially is that true of his political thought. You will note in the list of readings that I have recommended for further reading, there is a book by him which is a nice statement, not very long, about 150 pages, of his theological view with regard to the nature of politics. It's a good read if you are interested in that part of the themes of this course. I would go so far as to say that Nick Wolterstorff is the most important Reformed thinker of our time. The most important Reformed thinker of our time. This is somebody who's an intellectual heavyweight and somebody who, writing out of the Reformed tradition and is very well informed about the Reformed tradition, has a lot of things to say that are relevant to the sort of themes we're dealing with here. I might add that even though he's not really much influenced by Barth, the thought that he articulates, particularly on the topic we're discussing in this session, is very much in keeping with Barth. very much in keeping with the things I had to say last time about Barth. Note the title of his piece: Do Christians Have Good Reasons for Supporting Liberal Democracy? Do Christians have good reasons for supporting liberal democracy? Now, the first time I read that, and this is many years ago, I thought, well, why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they? Well, of course, he's referring here to the fact that there are now increasing numbers of people who are skeptical about that. He's referring to the kind of people that identify with the Newhouse point of view. He recognizes at the beginning of his piece that there are growing numbers of Christians who, unlike in the past, perhaps, have had real doubts about the appropriateness of their embrace of liberal democracy as Christians. Let me put it that way. Have real doubts about the wisdom, the propriety of their affirming liberal democracy. Why? Well, in part because of the trajectory of public life, the way in which things have been moving in the last 40 and 50 years. But also, and now I want to take up what I think is really important in his essay. He says, in addition to just the trajectory of public life, the other thing which has to be recognized is that there is a long tradition of Christians assuming, and of course he's talking about in predominantly Christian countries, of Christians assuming that they have a right and a responsibility to direct public affairs, a right and a responsibility to be in control, to be in charge, to direct public affairs. And he said, if you are thinking in those terms, then of course there's going to be some hesitation about embracing liberal democracy. Why? Well, because, as I've been talking about earlier in this presentation, liberal democracy seems to be moving in a direction which, if not marginalizing religion, at least diminishes the standing, the authority of Christians in relation to the body politic. Now, Wolterstorff then goes on to say, and this is what I think is terribly important about his essay and the way of thinking he represents, it's time now, he says, to change the way we think about these matters. Let me say that again. It's time for us to change the way we think about the relationship between Christians in public life on this crucial matter. It's time to give up, in other words, the premise that seeking hegemony in public life is somehow our right and our responsibility. I'll say that again. It's time to give that up, walk away from that, abandon that, and begin thinking about this matter in a different way. Yes, I know, he says, and he's as good a Calvin scholar as anybody. He says, yes, I know that for a long, long time, we have held on to this idea of the Holy Commonwealth as our responsibility. He said, many people read the Bible that way. They read the Bible in such a way that their conclusion is that Christians should go out into the world and dominate the world, or at least as much as possible, try to dominate public life, even in democratic societies. And he says, and I'm just repeating here what I said earlier, but it's worth noting that he says the same thing. He says, and even after, in our tradition, people accepted the necessity of toleration, the value of toleration, the value of religious liberties, religious liberty, they still held on to the idea that we should be in charge. So that's been our tradition. And he's very self-conscious in this essay of saying that's the way so many of us have thought. And it's been handed down to us from previous generations. And we've seen all kinds of experiments in the Netherlands and in England and New England and so forth conducted on those terms. But it's time now, he says, to realize, for reasons that he says I think are quite good reasons, that it's inappropriate for us to continue thinking that way and conducting ourselves that way. Why? Well, if we continue to try to dominate, even if we could do it, and of course that's the big issue, You can say to somebody like Newhouse, yeah, I know you have that ambition, but could you really do it? But let's just set aside for the moment the practical possibility of it. Even if we could do it, is it the right thing to do? And Wolterstorff's answer is no, it's not the right thing to do. It is the wrong thing to do. And he's very, very not just pointed here, but I would say even a little bit strident. It's the wrong thing for us to do. It's inconsistent, he says, with the commitments we make as people who are committed to constitutional democracy. Let me say that again. It's inconsistent with our commitment to constitutional democracy, because our commitment to constitutional democracy presupposes a commitment to political equality. And so if we say with one breath, we are committed to political equality, but in the next breath, we should be in charge, there's a profound inconsistency there. And then he goes on to say the following. He says it in two different ways. He says to assume that we should be in charge, having committed ourselves, having been committed in the previous statement to democratic practices, that we should be in charge. He says, at the very least, what we're doing there is unfair. At the very least, it's unfair. We're treating those whom we would marginalize as second-class, third-class citizens. They have every bit as much as right to not only to be involved in public life, but to flourish and prevail even in public life as we do. So there he's embracing, if you will, political pluralism as a natural byproduct of our commitment to constitutional democracy. But he goes even farther than that. He says, one of the things that we have learned in our previous working through the issue of toleration, but we've never quite carried through to conclusion, is this: inflicting in a coercive way our values on somebody else is and here are his words, very great evil. Very great evil. It's a denial of something which is fundamental to this whole constitutional democratic way of thinking. And then he says, and for my money, he's not sufficiently theological in this piece. He could be more theological. That's why I like to think of Wolterstorff and Barth as complementary on this, because I think Barth adds some things that Wolterstorff does not. But he says the following. He says, it is really inconsistent with what we preach as Christians, which is, of course, to do unto the neighbor what we would do to ourselves. Treating the neighbor with real respect. He says that's a gospel imperative. Do unto others as you would, etc. So the implication, and I think this is, by the way, what Barth had in mind when he said constitutional democracy and all the practices that it involves is a kind of natural byproduct of living out consistently the gospel ethic in public life. It's treating the other with the full measure of respect. That's the Barthian idea. And then, and here I'm drawing more upon Wolterstorff's book than the essay itself. He says the following. The obvious next question is, well, what then is the Christian's role in public life? What exactly is the Christian's role in public life if it's not to what? Try to take control. And the answer is this: not to rule, but to work collaboratively with others. Not to rule, but to work collaboratively with others. He said we've too easily translated divine sovereignty into our rule, working in partnership rather than trying to dominate others. Or, and here I would again refer back to Barth. You may recall that Barth, I think a wonderful image, said in that piece that written in the 1940s. He said, it's best to think of Christians in public life as a leaven. And you may recall that in the Barth piece, here I'm going beyond Wolterstorff in the Barth piece, he rather directly says there is a danger in Christians trying to take control of the state. And that is turning Christianity into one more partisan cause. That's a powerful idea. Turning Christianity into one more partisan political cause. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why Karl Barth was so opposed to the thing which was so popular, especially in the aftermath of the Second World War in Western Europe, the idea of the Christian Democratic Party. I hope you see the tension between the idea of the party and Levin, because the party can win. The party can take control. And so there is, in Barth, a warning there. And one other thing from Barth, which is worth not just mentioning, but highlighting, relating to, I think it's kind of the same thing as what Wolterstorff is discussing more philosophically. You may recall that Barth says, Reformed thought has too long relied largely, not exclusively, but largely on the Old Testament for its political ethics. Reformed thought has relied heavily upon the Old Testament. Even the constitutional republic idea in the Old Testament. Sovereignty of the law in the Old Testament. The covenant image, Old Testament. Relied heavily upon the Old Testament, maybe to the neglect of the New Testament. And Barth says, it is probably important now for us as we think about post-war situation, or in our case, this new pluralistic situation, to recognize even more the importance of thinking through the implications of a gospel ethic for interacting with people of other political religious persuasions. One or two other comments, and then I'll stop. I view this Wolterstorff essay as carrying to its logical conclusion the thing we encountered in Abraham Kuyper. You may remember Abraham Kuyper said, it is really pluralism in religion as well as pluralism in politics is a good thing, is a good thing. Indeed, Kuyper goes so far as to suggest that pluralism in religion is probably a manifestation, believe it or not, of the will of God, working out the sort of the complex relationship between faith and the human condition. So Kuyper embraces pluralism. That's one of his great strengths, and I think Wolterstorff is somebody who is sort of carrying that idea to the next step, if you will, the step which is required by this new heightened religious pluralism in our own time. I could go on, but I'm not going to. I'm going to stop there, and we'll take a break, come back in about 10 minutes, and I'm going to invite your questions and comments and see where that goes.
And they just stuck with this plan. The Federalists on the legal side, where it came from, and they were always picking out judges to be nominated whenever they had a chance to do it. And the Democrats, the more liberal side, just sat on their haunches and didn't do much about it. Particularly, they figured out, the point you made, Bruce, that you need to get people who can get the judges that you want appointed. You can identify judges, but you've got to have the ability to do it. And they went out and gerrymandered 2-3 times in a row, and particularly in 2010, gerrymandered everything. And then it was all a big strategic plan. And for whatever reason, our side of this debate sat back, and you know, it's like who Will Rogers says he doesn't belong to any Democratic, or whatever it was, he belonged to the Democratic Party. It just was no coordination. So that was a very principled, focused 4-year effort, and it's come sort of to fruition. But they still needed somebody to do the appointing. And that came in 2016 when they were able to make that switch. So think of how we would feel now if Hillary had won, and there were now 6 liberal justices on the Supreme Court and 3 conservatives. We would think it's just great if that's the way you think. And so there's a little bit of well, voting matters. They won the battle. They should get the spoils. Our response has to be over a generation to respond back and have a counter effort. So that's just sort of my view of the court process. And it doesn't tie into here particularly, Bruce, but it does, I think, in the sense that along with that effort comes a religious component to that. Just a comment before I go to church.
Well, let me respond. I think the big theoretical question that is in play in this is the following. If you are unhappy, as clearly Newhouse and others were, with the state of the courts, the state of the sort of the trajectory of constitutional law in that period, if you're unhappy, as some people on this call, maybe many of us will be already beginning to be, and will be even more in the years to come, what do you do about it? It seems to me it's entirely appropriate within the sort of the ethics of constitutional democracy to take steps to try to replace the people who are on the court now with other people who are more to your liking. Excuse me, that's entirely consistent with the best ethics of constitutional democracy. What is problematic is when you begin, and I think this is the populist kind of element entering in, is when you try to take steps to manipulate that process in ways which appear to be manifestly unfair. And I would include gerrymandering in that. In other words, you work really hard to rig the decision-making process in a way that yields the desired outcome. Now, I'm going to talk, you'll get it on later, Adrian, when you listen to the recording, but I'm going to talk at the end of this presentation about the steps that have been taken, not so much to some extent in the United States, but even more elsewhere, that move away from this constitutional democratic ethos. And the Republican Party and the Federalist Society has, particularly the Republican Party, not so much the Federalist Society, have flirted with that for quite some time. Trump is sort of the latest development in that process.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think that's right. It's just that they took it as a 30 to 40 year project, which it was.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, that's good politics.
Yes, and that's what the other side of that needs to do that now. 50 years from now, when most of us aren't here anyway, none of us are probably here, it needs to be fixed. The other country besides Hungary is also Poland, which has just pretty much eliminated a different approach to the judiciary. It just pretty much legislated them out of any kind of control. And the EU is the only reason there's any kind of independent judiciary left in Poland. So who knows where we would have gone,
So let's keep a distinction here between political combat and things which challenge the very nature of the regime.
Yeah.
And political, by the way, let me quote Max Weber here. Politics is a long, slow boring of hard boards. I love that quotation. A long, slow boring of hard boards. He's talking about the kind of politics that you were referring to. It takes decades to pursue typically the things that are worth achieving in politics. And the Federalist Society, whatever you think of the merits of their position, you're exactly right. That's what they did. They worked very hard to pursue a very specific project.
Well, thank you. I will leave. Thank you very much for this.
Floor is open for questions and comments and discussion. Doris.
When you were talking about this move, this populist move, and moving to more secularization of our politics, it seems to me that we should be able to hold on to our moral values and still be strong proponents of constitutional democracy. I don't think that that Christian moral values are that different from moral values of people who are not Christians. And that, you can have, you can welcome pluralism religiously, ethnically, every other kind of way, and be very much in favor of a strong constitutional democracy, and still hold on to the moral values that you think are for the good of the country. It seems to me, I don't think that they have to be, opposing things.
I think that's absolutely right, but let me just push back a little bit. I think it's entirely, let me step back again. Many of the people that we have looked at who have been proponents of constitutional democracy, explicit proponents of constitutional democracy, have recognized that when you get into public life, you interact with people who are of other faiths or no faith at all. And that many times, not always, you can make common cause with those people. Indeed, that is the thing which makes the idea of a successful constitutional democracy possible. It's always been the case. But it becomes more of an issue, I would say, Doris, and a more complicated issue if you forsake the idea that, yeah, we're going to have working together, but we're in charge. If you move in the direction of playing a more humble role, then it becomes so we say, a more complicated proposition. That's the first thing I want to say, and I think that's what's so interesting about our current situation. It is more complicated because, in part, a good many, not a small number, a good many Protestants, Catholics, and so forth, have moved in the direction of what I would characterize this more collaborative understanding of their role in public life. And it's related to their lived experience with pluralism. I think all of us have encountered people of other faiths and no faith at all, or at least no faith that we recognize as religious, who are good collaboration partners on projects on matters that are important to us. The only thing I would add to what you're saying is not everything out there is something that we should affirm. And sometimes in the interplay of public life, you encounter things that need to be opposed, need actively to be opposed, and there's not a shared value there. On the contrary, there's conflict built into that. Sometimes the embrace of pluralism tends to take on I'm going to sound snotty here, but a sort of kumbaya quality, like, oh, we're all in this together, and isn't it wonderful? No, that's not true. In public life, there are serious, I need not remind anybody on this call, but I think I need to make this point here. There are serious conflicts that sometimes somebody says something in the public square, oftentimes a very principled position, you just disagree with. You disagree with, and you if you're sort of a thoughtful Christian, you disagree with that for very good theological reasons. I mean, in my own case, it tends to be more on economics than other matters. I encounter it all the time, things that I really disagree with, and at that point, I'm not making common cause at all. I'm making common cause against them. So.
I have a question.
Melissa.
You talked about Wolterstorff saying that Reformed, that's not right. I know it's probably wrong, but has depended more on the Old Testament for reliance on law instead of something from the New Testament. But that made me think about covenant. And then I went back to Winthrop, which sounds like a good thing to draw on with thinking about the whole thing of working collaboratively. and looking out for one another and caring for one another. So I can see the critique, but I wonder if there's more to our reliance than that.
2 or 3 comments. When I was making that point, I was referring more to Barth than Wolterstorff.
Okay.
It's Barth who makes that point. My guess is, and it's not as developed a point in Barth as it could be, at least in the passage that I'm referring to. My guess is that Barth would say, of course, what I'm really arguing for is a complementarity of Old and New Testament. Let me just intrude a very interesting conversation I had some years ago with somebody out of an Anabaptist tradition. I was speaking somewhere and I was drawing upon a lot of Old Testament themes and talking about politics. And he put his hand up and he said, "This is a Christian church. Don't we recognize that with the coming of Jesus Christ, things changed fundamentally?" And he then went on to the typical Anabaptist argument about how the ethic of Christians with regard to politics has to be utterly different from anything in the Old Testament. And then I went on to talk about the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament in Reformed thought. You're absolutely right. All those themes of covenant and law and a whole series, they're all drawn from the Old Testament. And it's partly, I would say, it's partly because in Reformed thought, there was a very direct encounter with the challenge of wielding political power. And the Anabaptists walked away from it. They sort of separated themselves from politics, thinking that politics was not the Christian responsibility. Well, once you say it is the Christian responsibility, then and at the same time you're basing your politics on the Bible, to where do you turn? You don't turn much to the New Testament. At least that's not the obvious place to turn to. It's the Old Testament. And so you get those themes to which you allude, and Winthrop and a whole series of other people, which are very much Old Testament themes. I think Barth's point would be, we've so allowed our thinking to be shaped by that particular part of Scripture that we have neglected some of the themes in the New Testament which could enrich and to some extent correct sort of problematic tendencies if you rely simply on the Old Testament. Let me just say more broadly, I don't think you can have, I don't think you can say in anything that, any statement that would be consistent with the Reformed tradition, that the Old Testament themes are unimportant with regard to politics. That's part of our, sort of our, those are crucial elements of our identity. Starting, I would say, with the idea of covenant. It's not the only one, but it's the crucial. So I doubt, Melissa, very much that there would be serious disagreement between the person I was citing, which was Barth, and you on that point. And by the way, I think that point that Barth made is very interesting and very, very pertinent to this current challenge that we find ourselves facing. Other issues? How many of you found the Wolterstorff reading hard? Hands up. It's so funny how he's a wonderful speaker. I mean, you have him in a context of just giving a talk. He's a very engaging speaker. There's something about these philosophers, especially analytic philosophers, when they take pen in hand, it just forces them into a kind of mode of expression that I think it's not easily comprehensible for somebody who's not an analytic philosopher. So I apologize for that, but I wanted you to get the argument, even if the argument was not well packaged. Anything else? Going once, twice. All right, let's move on.
Bruce?
Who's
This is Wayne. I just have a quick question.
Sure.
I wrote up on the chat board, I had a question about the concept of religious pluralism. And it's kind of a fuzzy concept outside of the Christian framework. How does religious pluralism also include accepting the influence of non-Christians in the constitutional democracy? In other words, it's difficult for me to imagine that taking place, or there would be a resistance if a non-Christian group starts to exercise influence in the political dynamics of a country or in its moral thinking. And maybe is this one of the fears that are brought to the surface through the expression of populism?
Well, thanks for the question, or questions, actually. I would say religious pluralism is a description of a fact. That's the first thing. It doesn't, as a concept, it seems to me, imply anything about behavior. It simply says there is this is the way it's used typically. In this society, there are in the beliefs and practices of its citizens, there are a plurality of faiths that are embraced. That's what it means. And therefore, you could say that for much of the history of the United States, if not all, it has been to some extent a religiously pluralistic society. You've had Jews, and various others, but in small numbers typically. And they have been, and this is the maybe central to what I was, history I was trying to trace out. They have been tolerated, but the assumption has been for the longest time that they were not really going to have much political influence. In the course of the 20th century, Roman Catholics pushed back upon that very hard. And it was related to changing demographics. The more Roman Catholic, especially in certain cities and states, you got organized opposition coming from Roman Catholics, and there was a sort of pressure in the direction of what I would characterize as a sort of modest pluralism. And by the time of the New Deal, Jews become part of that equation as well. So that by the middle of the 20th century, people are kind of hesitant, including a lot of people who still embrace the old way of thinking that was characterizing this simply and unambiguously as a Christian nation. They would say, no, there's a famous book, for example, by a Jewish scholar, really a period piece, but a very, very interesting formulation. Will Herberg wrote this book called Protestant Catholic Jew, published in the 1950s. Many of us I read it as an undergraduate. And it was, to some people, it's kind of a startling formulation. The United States is a nation that's tripartite in its religious identity. Now, he acknowledged in the course of that book that still the overwhelming majority of Americans were Protestants, but there was a kind of pluralism there. And by the way, all along, there was even more complex pluralism than that. What are the Mormons, for example? Are they, the whole debate about Mormons and political identity and a religious identity and political identity is a complex mix. And then you had people from East Asia representing other kinds of religious traditions, and some from the Middle East even. There have always been some sliver of people representing Islam in our country. The big change now is the following. Up until, well, I would say starting with the school prayer decision in the middle decades of the 20th century, but moving forward, the drift of constitutional law has been to say, this country, whatever its actual religious demographics, needs to think of itself as religiously pluralistic in a stronger sense than the one I just described.
Yeah.
And that in turn is the source of the uneasiness.
Mm-hmm.
That's the source of the uneasiness, because the more you begin to see, my goodness, there's a Muslim mayor of this town.
Yeah.
He's got a chance of winning, or a Muslim senator, or a Buddhist, whatever, and that begins to, I would say, unsettle a certain segment of the population.
Right.
Now, just to complete sorry for you invited in effect another lecture, but here it comes. No, your question helps to clarify this thing. I want to keep emphasizing, as I did last time, I think it is a minority of people in this country who really have this, I would characterize it as nativist response to religious pluralism, saying, this is terrible. This is terrible. It's, however, a politically very active, and I would say strident minority. And that's at the heart of the populist challenge. Enough people saying, this is a problem, we've got to do something about it, wringing their hands. And by the way, one of the things which is missing in a lot of this discussion, task for somebody in this, maybe for another conversation sometime, generally the nativist position is accompanied by a very scary scenario, like replacement, a very scary scenario about the future. You know, if we do that, then, oh my goodness. Now, I think what is needed is an alternative scenario. And it's what I believe in my heart of hearts. I don't see this pluralism as scary. I really don't. I see it as a sort of possibility. Not to be sure, it's not going to be easy to achieve, but the possibility of a genuine religious pluralism combined with constitutional democracy, that would be a kind of, it seems to me, nice sequel to the previous developments, positive developments in the history of the American Republic. So it's literally that's at stake. And I think all too often, there's not enough articulation of the opportunity, the possibility, the hopeful, if you will, vision of where this could take us. And I'm guessing that if that were articulated well, it would be, to many people, viewed as a winsome thing. That's kind of what I believe. That's what I want to see happen. Other thoughts before we go on? Thank you for that question, though, because it seems to me that gets to the heart of what we're talking about.
Bruce?
Bill?
It seems to me that there has always been the problem of the minority, if you will. Certainly that was suppressed, if there was one, in the right after the Reformation. If you look at John Winthrop's Massachusetts Bay Colony, at one point there was a reflow of immigration, that is, people abandoning the new world because it was too rigid and too hard to live with. And I think that today the problem is created by the fact that the country has a mixture of people who are of sufficient prevalence that it's felt that they can't be suppressed, that they've got to be accommodated. I'm not sure that things really have changed all that much, other than that there are some people, I think, that don't want change, are uncomfortable with change, and they, and these things may perhaps change in the course of a lifetime. But I think when you look at this country, the changes that have been accommodated, particularly in the civil rights area, are amazing. And I think that it's a question of speed, and for some people, it's things are changing faster than they're comfortable with.
Well, I think it's partly change and partly just a rehearsal of old problems, but I don't think it's just that. I think in principle, the issue of pluralism that we've talked about in the last exchange is not fundamentally different from what it has been in the past. But when the facts on the ground change, the issue of principle takes on a coloration that's different from what it had been in the past. In the past, a lot of the discussion about the status of minorities was, I would say, milder, not to be sure completely mild, but milder than it is now. And I think the reason that it's different now is because the facts on the ground are so different. And I think you're absolutely right that we've now got a situation in which minorities of various different kinds, they can't be suppressed. I think that is absolutely right. At least people, even people who would like them to be suppressed, in a sense they can't really be suppressed. But what they can be is marginalized. But what they can be is denied real political influence, to push them to the edges of political influence. And if you can't completely exclude them, at least limit the chances of their really having a significant power. Let me go on. I want to raise two other topics before we're done. One is some further thoughts about Wolterstorff, and then I want to talk a little bit and invite further discussion about the case of Hungary. You may know a lot about that. You may not know much about that, but it's a really important part of our topic. Let me begin, as I talk about Wolterstorff, by saying I find in principle the positive part of his argument to be very persuasive. And I think the direction in which he takes us is the right way to respond, at least as a Reformed Protestant, the right way to respond to the challenge of religious pluralism. And as I said before, and let me say it again, I think his work on this subject is a very creative development of the Reformed political tradition. I've been trying to lay out a story here over these last 4 weeks of the unfolding of the Reformed political tradition. And you've picked up, I'm sure, as we've gone along, that there's been a lot of self-criticism. People saying, yeah, Calvin was right about this, but he was wrong about that. And that needs to be changed. And here's another, I think, important addition to that tradition. And Wolterstorff makes a significant contribution by making the point that it is simply inconsistent. It is simply inconsistent if you are a believer in constitutional democracy, then to assign to people of other religious beliefs a second-class status. That's just wrong. It's inconsistent and it's deeply problematic. And I think he makes a good point when he says it's probably inconsistent with what most of us would understand to be the moral implications of the teachings of Jesus about treating the neighbor. Having said all that, however, I still have a quarrel with Wolterstorff, and it's not a small quarrel. You will note that his whole framing of the issue is in terms of liberal democracy, not constitutional democracy. And I think his thinking about the subject of liberal democracy reflects a kind of uncritical embrace of liberal democracy. And I consider that very problematic. I think he falsifies for his own purpose what liberalism really is as a moral and political philosophy. I should say what it is now more than ever. I'll talk about that in just a moment. I would specify the problem with it this way. He wants to say that liberalism is about nothing more than the defense of human rights. It's just about the defense of human rights. Liberal regimes are regimes which defend human rights well. That, over and over again, that's what he says. Now, I don't deny that's part of what liberalism is, but I don't think that's the whole story at all. It is a moral as well as a political philosophy. It is a moral as well as a political philosophy, and I've already introduced one of its central problems as far as I'm concerned. I talked about this last week. I think liberalism as a moral as well as a political philosophy needs to be understood this way. It privileges in a special way personal liberty. It privileges in a special way personal liberty. It's no accident that most of the great works in the liberal tradition, starting with John Stuart Mill's On Liberty or Hayek's Constitution of Liberty, they all have that idea at the center of their thought, that the goal of a good society is to maximize the opportunities for personal liberty, to be able to choose what you want to do, how you want, etc. Now, believe me, I'm no enemy of personal liberty, but I think to make personal liberty, to privilege it in that way is to what? Complicate our relationship to other values, including social justice. I think sometimes personal liberty needs to be qualified in order to do justice to other things that matter to us. I think, again, as a Reformed person, a Reformed Protestant, I think our vision of a good society should be a complex one involving a number of different values. I think that's consistent with what the authors we've read. So the first problem is, and by the way, this single-minded preoccupation with personal liberty translates into all sorts of very specific choices on everything, whether it be free markets or abortion or whatever. Again and again and again, it sort of skews the discussion towards one particular set of outcomes. But the other thing which is characteristic of liberalism as a moral and political philosophy is that it marginalizes religion. It marginalizes religion in public life. And the irony about it is, the thing that makes me so puzzled about it is, Wolterstorff, in his philosophical writing, has spent a lot of time and energy critiquing liberal authors on just this point. The most famous liberal thinker of our time, some of you may or may not know, is a man called John Rawls, R-A-W-L-S. Particularly a famous book called A Theory of Justice, written in the 1970s, and then another book published in the 1990s called Political Liberalism. Those are two, I'll tell you, if you enjoyed reading Wolterstorff, you will love reading Rawls. It's that same kind of complicated way of expressing, but those are terribly important books. They have been very influential in, for example, shaping Supreme Court decisions. And many of the Federalist Society's anxieties about the court involve the extending of the influence of Rawls into one domain after another. Now, Rawls, particularly in political liberalism, makes it very clear. He basically says, and he got challenged on this and was sort of backtracked a little bit, but he basically said, it is better for public life if people keep their mouths shut about religion. It is better for public life if people keep their mouths shut about religion. Why? Because religion is divisive. Religion is divisive. You know, you may have your own personal views about religion, and that's fine, but keep your mouth shut about any of that stuff. Don't talk about Jesus. Don't get that, because that's divisive. I have to say, it's just an aside here. It was a wonderful moment. One of his critics said, so you would say that Martin Luther King Jr.'s intervention in public life was not a good one. He corrected his stance somewhat on that. It was just a marvelous moment. He clearly hadn't thought about the implications of this. I mean, generally, prophetic voices in public life are rather open about their convictions, their religious thus saith the Lord. I won't bore you with the details, but there were some wonderful exchanges about, John Rawls says, thus saith me, not the Lord, but thus saith me. That would be the properly sanitized way of speaking in public life. At any rate, but that's not just Rawls. It's John Dewey, it's John Stuart Mill, it's a whole series of people going back in the history of the liberal tradition saying, keep religion out of politics, marginalize religion. Now, for those reasons, and those are not small reasons, for those reasons, I think it is very problematic to embrace liberal democracy and as an idea. And by the way, let me state the obvious, and I think you can appreciate this even more now that you've read Orban's critique. It plays right into the populist critique of constitutional democracy. It plays right into it, because they can say, well, what these people are really about is driving religion out of public life. And I have to say, there's enough truth to that, that it's very worrisome to me for people to speak as though liberal democracy were the obvious way to characterize the thing which I value. I think it's far better to speak of constitutional democracy. Now, having said all that, and that's, I think, something that I appreciate more, having now devoted some time to really studying the Reformed political tradition. The Reformed political tradition, it seems to me, issues in a strong endorsement for constitutional democracy, but probably problematizes the idea of liberal democracy. Let me say that again. It issues in a strong endorsement of the idea of constitutional democracy, but is wary of this idea of liberal democracy, which is a particular way of thinking about the institutions and practices of democratic politics. Now, there's one other thing, as I said, I want to take up before bringing these sessions to an end, or at least my contribution to these sessions to an end, and that is to talk to you a little bit about Hungary and Orban. My guess is you probably wondered a bit if you were doing the reading for this session, why is he asking us to read a statement by the Hungarian Prime Minister? How is that relevant? Well, it's very relevant for the following reason. This guy and this regime has become increasingly a kind of symbol in the world for the sort of the religious version of the populist critique of constitutional democracy. And I would say it's especially fashionable among conservatives in American politics who are sort of supporters of the populist impulse, like Tucker Carlson and a number of other people I could mention. By the way, it's kind of amazing that the American Conservative Political Action Conference is actually being held I think right now in Budapest, because and Orban gave an address to this convention and said if he had his way, Tucker Carlson would be on TV 24 hours a day. They are enthusiastically embracing one another. Now, that in and of itself is interesting, but the thing that's so interesting about this is that it provides a roadmap. If you're supportive of this idea of a kind of populist challenge to constitutional democracy, Orban and the movement he leads provides a map as to how to do it. Or conversely, if you aren't sympathetic to this, you can get a sense of what it might look like if it were pursued in the United States and elsewhere. First, a few words about him. There's some ironies here. This man, of course, is an attorney and led a movement, the movement that he now presides over. Fidesz is a kind of an extension of an anti-communist youth group that emerged in the late 1980s. He became the leader of that as a political party in the 1990s. But before I get into his political career, I have to say, there, irony upon irony, he studied for a while at Oxford with a fellowship from George Soros. I'm sorry, I can't help but laugh. So you might say Soros subsidized this. He studied at Oxford. He came back, and in the early 1990s, apparently he was not very religious at all. But in the 1990s, underwent a religious conversion of sorts. And by the way, his background is in the Hungarian Reformed Church, and he has characterized himself on occasion as a Calvinist. In the early 1990s, he married a woman who's Roman Catholic, and their children are being raised as Roman Catholics. But he inserted into this movement, which previously had been rather secular, a theme of the defense of Christian values. Sound familiar? The defense of Christian values and Christian civilization. And so that became part of the sort of mantra of this movement. He was a member of parliament for a while and eventually became prime minister for a brief period in the late 1990s and early 2000s, 1998 to 2002. He was voted out of office with some corruption schemes, got into trouble there, but eventually came back in a comeback and was elected with a large majority. His party won a supermajority in 2010, and that's crucial. A supermajority. That's what the Democrats haven't got right now in either house of Congress. A supermajority is a majority that enables you to. It's large enough that you really don't worry too much about razor thin vote counting. It's very easy to get what you want done, as long as there's sort of party discipline. He became prime minister for the second time in 2010, and he has been prime minister ever since. That's part of the deal. Over a decade, won several elections. And by the way, those elections he has won handily. The party has won handily. So they can claim that they represent a vast majority. Remember Newhouse, a vast majority of the people. But as he has pursued the project, which I'm about to go through, he's made it very clear, and it's so interesting, this phrasing, he insists upon that he's very much a Democrat. I am a Democrat. So, I hope I've been insisting all along, it's a little bit misleading to characterize the great challenge as liberal versus authoritarian. Or democratic versus authoritarian. It's rather two different versions of democracy. And he says, I am a Democrat of a certain kind. I'm an illiberal Democrat. Or sometimes he has characterized himself as a Christian Democrat. And by the way, a defender of Christian values against those liberal elitists. It's always that same kind of target, those liberal elitists who've taken over the European Union and are forcing us to, pressuring us to do things that we think are contrary to Christian values. Now, with that prolegomena, let me now get to the heart of this, because it's really, I think, quite fascinating. How do you, if you get to power, and he, by the way, he came to power through constitutional processes, constitutional democratic process. How do you turn things in a direction which are subversive of that constitutional democracy? And it's a very interesting strategy. The first thing you do, or one of the first things you want to do, is rewrite the Constitution. Rewrite the Constitution. And in the Hungarian case, rewrite the Constitution in a way that makes it explicit in a way that it wasn't before, that we are a society that's a Christian society based upon certain Christian values. I hope you see how that sort of reshuffles the deck. If you got that written into the Constitution, well, then a lot of other things are permissible or not permissible, as the case may be. And by the way, reading simply about their rewriting of the Constitution is a fascinating process, is a fascinating little story in and of itself. I invite you to look it up if you're interested. There's plenty of stuff on this. Secondly, you redraw parliamentary districts. If you're trying to what? If you're trying to establish a sustained majority over a period of time, so you don't constantly have to worry about losing elections, then you gerrymander, to use the American term. You gerrymander. So you rewrite the Constitution, you gerrymander so that more and more the people that you want in public office have pretty safe seats. Adrian referred to this before he left, you restructure the judiciary. You pressure sitting judges to retire. You pass a retirement age that forces a good number of them to retire, and you replace them with your own people. You also restructure legislatively what the courts can and cannot do. Still got courts, but they're not the same courts as they once were. Large-scale dismissal of civil servants and their replacement by new people. Large-scale dismissal. In Washington, if this happened in Washington, there would be a lot of for sale signs. Another very important part of this, the media. In the main, what has happened in Hungary is that the independent media have been, consolidated into some form of either public control or control of people who are allied with the ruling party. Oftentimes through tax law, forcing people who have been owners of independent media to sell them, pressuring them to creating a circumstance where they feel pressured to sell, and they do sell. And the result is a reconfiguration of the public media. And then finally, a part of this, which is very interesting, I think, is subsidizing certain churches and not others. Public funds, especially the Roman Catholic Church and the Hungarian Reformed Church, who have been supportive of this move. Some, to their credit, some evangelicals have been very critical, that is, independent evangelical churches, and they have been denied this public support. Now, that's the, if you will, that's the sort of institutional reconfiguration. And I hope you see, if you make those changes, you're well on the way to changing fundamentally the character of the polity. Let me say that again. If you make changes of that kind, you're on your way to remaking the polity. It is no longer, as the EU has said in response to these things, this is, they characterize it as democratic backsliding. This is no longer a constitutional democracy in the sense in which it's commonly understood. This is something else. This is a different kind of democracy. A couple of other things to note. On the policy side, a very strong, vigorous anti-immigrant stance, especially in the conflict with the EU. EU asking countries to accept immigrants from the Middle East, largely Muslim. Hungary refused. Why? On what grounds? We're building a Christian country. We don't need these outsiders. And coupled with that, a family policy, quote unquote, a family policy designed to what? Encourage the increase in Christian births. Families would get substantial subsidies if they had, that is Hungarian families, if they had more than 2 children. Active policy of what? Promoting enhanced fertility among the Christian population. Very vigorous resistance to anything that smacked up multiculturalism. That, of course, was a very important issue, has been a very important issue in the European Union. And it's related to the earlier exchange we had about what exactly is religious pluralism. One response to religious pluralism is to embrace this idea of a multicultural identity. And there's been a great struggle over this in the European Union. But this Hungarian outlier has said basically flatly, this is not what we want. We're not that kind of society. We don't want to be pulled in that direction. Let me go back to the politics of this for just a second. This is clearly a move in the direction, not quite of one-party rule, but maybe 1.5-party rule. And it's sustained one-party rule. You will continue to have elections of a sort, but the elections are, well, it looks to an outsider like a kind of rigged election. Very difficult for opposing parties to get the voice, let alone to get the vote. If the media, for example, are dominated by the government forces, then it's very difficult to even get a hearing for the things you want to do. Oh, the other thing I forgot to mention is a real sort of pressure on civil society to exclude dissenting voices. Central European University, I'm sure many of you knew, founded by, at least funded by Soros, was driven out of Hungary. It's now in Austria. Now, I could go on, but I hope a picture is forming in your mind. If you want to imagine what a movement of a populist movement in the direction of something other than constitutional democracy would look like, this is a pretty good illustration. And it's one of the reasons why there has been such interest in this on the part of people who have this sort of populist impulse in American politics. As I said, there's been a whole kind of train of people traveling over to Hungary to take a look and to have dialogue with Orban about the future of our movement. Let me stop there. I assume there's enough grist there for a little grinding of the mill. So let's open it up for comments and questions and rebuttal.
Bruce, this is Wayne.
Yeah.
I'm glad you emphasized that point on the involvement or the meeting of the CPAC in Budapest, which I'll show my political colors here. I find absolutely appalling that it would take place there and that they would even allow themselves to be there, given those points that you've just outlined. It's certainly an alarming development for Europe. And I'm wondering if Orban also had gotten his encouragement from the Brexit exercise, where again, immigration was used, the loss of national sovereignty was another excuse for removing itself from the EU, and it sort of set in process this chain of nationalism, sovereignty, national identity, emphasis on religion or whatever your values. It's quite an astounding development, and it's also interesting that Orban may criticize the EU, but he certainly benefits from the EU. He makes his country gets an absolute fortune in support from the EU for infrastructure in his country. He's willing to take that naturally, but he's at the same time willing to bite the hand that feeds him.
All that I agree with, and let me just add one or two things. I don't know how I failed to make this point. I'm glad you brought it up. In every case, this is linked to a kind of nationalist project. This populist democracy is linked to Hungary first, America first, Britain first, well, England first, really, not Britain, England first, and so forth. And it's rather overtly nationalistic. It's us over against them. In Hungary's case, mainly over against the EU. And there's always a strong element of sort of, we're going to go our own way, and our own way is not only our right, but our responsibility. And it is intertwined with religion. There is, we Hungarians are Christians of a certain sort. We are Christians. And we don't want to become a society in which there are developments which compromise that. So nationalism is an integral part of this. I can't think of a case where it's not. And then, of course, the other thing, which I'm sure many of you know, is that there has developed a kind of, if we were talking about socialists, we would say a kind of populist international. He's very enthusiastic about Bolsonaro. And in part, he has sort of held Bolsonaro out as an example of the promoter of Christian values. It's that theme. And I'm sure many of you are aware that he's been very, very cagey in responding to the war in Ukraine, and is still. I'll just again be kind of partisan about this. Sort of played footsie with. He continues to play footsie with Putin on this. And the final point, you're absolutely right. This has been heavily subsidized by the European Union, and I think it is in part their reluctance to withdraw that support or qualify that support, which is one of the reasons why he's gotten away with as much as he has. But I must say this, to me, this is a remarkable development, particularly the Americans, because the Americans, presumably, these are still people who talk the language of constitutional democracy. And yet this is associating yourself with people with a regime, and a regime which has got, well-developed practices. It's not like you can claim ignorance, which are not compatible with constitutional ideals. They just aren't.
I really enjoyed, I forget which writer it was, but I think one of the writers described his government as a mafia government. In other words, the example you brought up with is if you as a publisher don't play my game, all of a sudden you find that the tax laws have changed to your disadvantage. So it's very mafia-like. They don't break your arm, but they certainly break your bank or encourage you to sell it. And so I thought that was a pretty unique description of that regime. And also Orban's in Orban's note, or in his speech, where he points out that there are employees of the EU that are paid 8 or 9 times what a Hungarian who could do the same job could do. So I want my people, my Hungarian people, to do these sorts of jobs that traditionally been done by EU bureaucrats, because they know the country better. You have somebody sitting in Brussels or even in Budapest for a while, not knowing the land, not knowing the system. They're getting paid very good money, and we could have a Hungarian doing that. And that's probably part and parcel of his reform in the civil service, maybe. I don't know. But it is interesting how he uses these practical examples that really relate to the small person, the bureaucrat. I mean, if I hear the story that there's a EU person sitting next to me in my government office and he's making 8 or 9 times the amount of money and he's making decisions that affect my country, I could do that. So it's interesting how he appeals to various levels of society.
Well, these movements would never succeed to the extent they do if there were not some empirical basis for the critique they give of the existing order. That's just that's the other thing I want to stress is, I think you're referring to Jan Miller's piece earlier, where he described, I think to me it was so suggestive to read that, about how the goal here is not quite ideological in the old fascist sense. It is rather power and the greed which then is linked to that, and you create a kind of kleptocracy that very much sort of pervades the way the regime governs. Bob Harris, I saw your hand.
I would like you to speak more, Bruce, about I guess Madison and the writers of the Constitution. What I wrestle with is how can we, and I'll use a broad we, as preachers and people who have try to have some influence on cousins and family outside our little local sphere of influence, who are sort of ambivalent about things, how can we have some influence on them using traditional Christian Reformed values and also values from our Constitution? I, for one, really valued your pushing me to read the Federalist 10. I did check out a book on Madison. Want to read more about James Madison. I hadn't appreciated his Reformed roots at Princeton University and John Witherspoon. And I will say also, I've recently disciplined myself to watch some segments of Fox News. Has been struck by how Fox News, just the whole tenor, preys on people's fears. First of all, there's the commentators themselves, and then the ads are, you've got to take these vitamins to keep yourself healthy, and if you do this, then you're going to live longer, and and contribute to this gun rights thing. It's just the whole thing preys on fears. And so my question to you is, say more about Madison and the writers of the Constitution and how we can incorporate some of those ideas now.
Well, thank you for that. Let me say 2 or 3 things. I think in conversation with other Americans, one of the first things that we need to do and be prepared to do is to engage in some serious conversation about what the foundations of American government really are. There's a kind of mythology that has developed on the right, very elaborate mythology, which it is a mythology, about what American government is, about what the founders were all about, and so forth. One of the things I've tried to put across here is that there are actually some fairly complicated ideas there. They're simple in a certain sense, but they're complicated in another sense. And I think most of us hear a phrase like American democracy, and we're kind of fuzzy about what exactly that means, except in a very vague sense. We probably know about separation of powers, we probably know about federalism, but that's about it. I think one of the basic things that we can do is simply to educate ourselves so as to have conversations with whoever about what exactly the American form of government is and why it was designed the way it was. One of the reasons I gave you that, asked you to read that article about Madison's fear of populism, that's a wonderful article. And it captures, I mean, Madison was a complicated thinker, and his genius was he appreciated, another way to put it is to say he appreciated the complexity of politics. It's not simple, it's complicated. And so his genius was to figure out a way to deal with that complexity in a way that was compatible with a democratic republic. Now that takes, you have to get your mind around that. You have to understand that. And I think if you do that, you're on your way to appreciating why constitutional government is preferable to this simpler alternative. I mean, at some point in that conversation you have with hypothetical whoever, they're going to start mouthing populist phrases. And I think it needs to be said that those phrases are not compatible with what I consider to be the strengths of the American regime as it was created in the 18th century. I also think it is very important to dispel the myth that, and this is very, very well developed now on the right, that the founding was a Christian project. It's nonsense. Again, going back to one of the themes of this whole discussion, you might say that the founding was a kind of pluralist project. That is, you had devout Christians, I've talked about some of them here, and you had deists, very secular Enlightenment types, who found what common ground to achieve something that satisfied both of them. Now, and the reason why that is important is because there is this idea, which is now being very, very aggressively promoted on the right, that the country was founded as a Christian nation to start with. No, it's more complicated than that, a lot more complicated than that. And there's a sense in which the founding was designed to protect against the excesses that the founders associated with that very idea. Does that help? Mm-hmm. And by the way, if you have not read the Federalist Paper number 10, read it. And if you've read it before and it's a long time ago, read it again. It's a masterpiece. Now, I know one other point I want to make, Bob, is I hope you picked up in the course of these 4 weeks, I'm not uncritical about the founding. The founding is not sacred to me at all. But it's as an achievement of, shall we say, the political art, it is very, very good. And the fact that they did as well as they did is, I think, I do subscribe to the idea that it was a kind of masterful achievement, and we still got this republic in part because of that. I saw Bill and Malone's hand. Bill, you're on.
It seems to me that if you look back at the history of this, it's been people who solved the liberalism problem by just moving. And you have the various immigration measures from France, from various religious groups within England, so on and so forth. What's perhaps made the problem more, and you have the Mormons who solved their problem by moving to nowhere that anybody would consider important. What's changed is the media. That is, if you consider the Mormons, they could, in Salt Lake City, they could do pretty much what they wanted to do. But now, of course, and I think you see that in the abortion dispute, we're apparently going to break down into, one geographic area that takes a position and a different geographic area that takes the opposite. And then we see that the problem with liberalism in the wedding cake case in the Supreme Court, where somebody says, I don't want to do that, and somebody else says, we're going to make you not discriminate against people you disagree with. It seems to me that the problem is in one sense the same as it's always been. You solve it by geographic separation, and in another sense you can't do that because the media is worldwide.
Well, I've already pleaded my ignorance on the question of media, including social media. And I concede that for purposes of this discussion, that's a real deficiency. I wish I knew more about it. I think you're right, Bill, that it certainly does change the character of some of these topics. And that's something I'm going to, personally, I've just made a note to self, I need to work on in order to be able to think through more carefully. Because the phenomenon that we've talked about today, that is a change in the facts on the ground with respect to religious pluralism, is just one part, needless to say, of a complex set of changes. And in order really to make sense of any one of them, you need to take into account more fully than I've been able to do in this set of talks, the full range of. So I would agree with you. It changes the character of the issues, and I wish I could say more constructively about what exactly that means. I'm looking at a screen that involves no hands up. So maybe I've had you to, we've talked it out. So I'm going to say to all of you, thank you very much. I've enjoyed your comments and your questions, and I hope we've all learned something. Have a good summer.
I miss the Reformed Institute being down here in Texas, where you just don't want to be right now. But I have a whole, it's expanded. Since my field is that church history, I have a whole new reading list that I'm going to have to deal with. Including rereading Niebuhr. I haven't read that since college, and that was a long time ago.
You're going to have fun with that this time around. You'll see it in a whole new light. He actually speaks in the beginning about the crisis of democracy, writing in the 1940s.
There are a number of these articles that we've read, and I go and look at the date, and they could have been written
Today.
last week.
Yes.
It's actually, I don't know whether it's frightening or somehow hopeful. You know, we've been here before multiple times, but I guess we'll all see. But thank you, Bruce.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I want to thank Bruce too. And I also miss the Reformed Institute down here in Tennessee. And so it's been really great to be able to take part in this.
You mean you don't have a Reformed Institute in Tennessee?
No, we don't. I actually took a class at Maryville College when I first came here to try to make up for the fact that the Reformed Institute wasn't here.
I want to weigh in from Maine as well and say what a joy it is just to be able to connect again with Bruce and the Reformed Institute and all of you. I've really missed it all. Somehow, I really feel that it would be wonderful if we could get the National Capital Presbytery to require all pastors to take this course from Bruce. I don't remember having most of this information ever shared in any of the courses I took in seminary or even in continuing education courses. So this kind of information and background is just invaluable in helping us, I think, who've been able to at least tune in a couple of times and be a part of this. But just for our pastors today to have this kind of background as they're trying to cope with all that is happening in our country and helping congregations to begin to have some kind of a background in what Presbyterians and Reformed theologians have had to say about these kinds of situations in the past. I think it would be just invaluable. Anyway, I know we can't require pastors to do those kinds of things, but I wish the heck we could, because it's just it's tremendous information and a tremendous help just in trying to cope with all that's going on now and having some larger perspective from which to deal with it.